Spiderman Miles Morales. This game was really an interesting one, so let's talk about it. As the second ever game review I've done on this channel, I want to preface this whole thing by saying that this is by no means the end-all be-all destination on the internet for great opinions on the game. Don't get me wrong, I think my opinions are valid, but I don't want you to take this video as me saying that my bad opinions are better than your bad opinions, because they probably aren't, and you know, on the internet, everyone's opinion is trash, for some odd reason. Nobody is allowed to be right, because if someone is right, that means someone is also wrong, and we can't have that, now can we? If we wanted a right or wrong, we'd be discussing this game in, I don't know, book club or something, not on Reddit. But with that out of the way, today I'm going to be officially reviewing Spider-Man Miles Morales. I know, I'm a bit late. I'm just irresponsible, no excuses. The game was a relatively short journey that had a lot going for it, plus some things that it could work on, but we'll get to that later. So the way this video game review thing works on the channel is I'm going to separate my thoughts on the game into 5 different categories and provide a separate rating for each, and at the end I'll give a cumulative weighted score and a final verdict. The 5 sections will be gameplay, replayability, music, graphics/performance, and story/writing, in that exact order. You'll also find that I separated the playback bar into separate chapters, so if you happen to be only interested in a single rating for a particular section of this game, you could jump to that part and watch to your heart's content. Also, I thought you should know that this video is 100% spoiler free, so if you haven't played the game yet or are waiting to get your PS5, rest easy and watch away. Just be warned that you may be affected by my trash opinion. But I guess that's probably why you're here. Anyways, let's get this show on the road with the first topic, gameplay. Alright, so I'm just gonna keep it straight up with you guys. The gameplay in this game was absolutely astounding. Like, it's not often that I have this much fun using a controller to play a game, but this time around it felt really nice. As you guys may or may not know, I am primarily a PC player, so often when I review console exclusive games, my lack of practice with a controller may start to show a bit, but this game did a really nice job of making it easy on me to just pick up and play. And I know those are the dreaded words that a lot of people absolutely hate hearing, that a game was too easy to play, because a lot of the time people understandably want a good challenge in their video games. You know, if we wanted to play something as easy as tic-tac-toe, we'd probably do that and not play video games. But honestly, I think that's what this game does right. The ultimate simplicity that button mashing brings to the table gives controller inept players like myself just enough leeway to get through the game without wanting to blow my brains out. But all it takes is a single deep dive into the menus to reveal a surprisingly difficult max difficulty level, as well as a list of super complex combos that a filthy casual like myself couldn't be bothered to learn since they aren't very necessary on the easier settings. So if you are that type of player that doesn't love themselves, you have the option to crank the difficulty settings up and learn all the proper combos for the proper situations and really make this game the pinnacle of the concept known as high risk, high reward. As in, very, very satisfying when you pull off a crazy 40 combo chain on the hardest difficulty, since you took the time to learn the most abstract page 8 combo that would only be useful in this particular situation, and it worked. But also very, very punishing when you're on the hardest difficulty level and don't know what to do, and nothing seems to be working. I should know, I take pretty great pride in the fact that I managed to pull off a full 25 minutes of gameplay on the hardest settings, dying only probably a maximum of 9-ish times. You know, before I had to turn it back down since I wasn't really looking for a challenge on this easy game anyway. What the? And what all of this means is that depending on how you have your game set up, the game could really tailor to all sorts of skill levels and preferences without ever feeling like it was designed to be played at a higher or lower difficulty setting, which is honestly pretty impressive. Other games usually just spawn more or less enemies on the map, which may or may not make sense in the context of the scene and generally doesn't make for good game difficulty design. But not this game. It does a much better job of making every difficulty level feel natural and just as doable as the last, leaving no deaths to the fault of pure RNG difficulty level BS that really can't be countered, assuming you put in the time to learn the necessary gameplay combos and movesets for each difficulty level that is. So generally speaking, if you die, it's most likely your fault, regardless of the difficulty level you are playing at, and I think that's beautiful. And another thing that I have to praise about the gameplay is just how low the health pool is. And when I say the health pool is low, I mean it's low, as in don't get hit by RPGs low. Well, not that that's an option in real life anyways. And you might be wondering, why are you so happy that the health bar is small? Well, it's because that it matches Miles Morales' aesthetic and also makes for some super satisfying combos. Allow me to explain. By basic video game lore, Miles Morales is smaller than Peter Parker in both size and weight. He's also less experienced at being, well, Spider-Man, and these are subtle details that transition quite nicely into the new game. While in Spider-Man 2018, Peter Parker feels a bit heavier, slower, and more balanced than Miles Morales on top of having a higher health pool, Miles is much more quick, nimble, and clumsy. You could even see it in his animations when compared to Peter's, which just look faster with a dab of luck sprinkled on top. And all of these differences mean that his fighting style might be significantly different than Peter's, which it is. Throw in a couple of new abilities like bioelectricity and camouflage, as well as what feels like a lower amount of health, and you have a character that seems to be much more combo based with a stark focus on being more elusive, even when compared to a game which was designed in the same way and runs on the exact same engine. It kind of feels like they took that concept and turned it up a notch. The concept of dodge, 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 combo, combo, combo. And when you master it, like I mentioned earlier, you could pull off some pretty sick combos even on the harder difficulty levels that make it hard for even the smarter AI to touch you, which feels amazing. The bottom line is, Miles Morales feels similar to Peter Parker, but different enough to warrant praise for the changes that Insomniac made to the fighting gameplay, because I see a lot of people saying that this game was a carbon copy of the original, and I think I'd have to disagree to a certain extent. You could definitely pick up this title and see it being a complete standalone had the length just been a bit longer. In fact, aside from the length, it feels like a complete standalone. The only thing that classifies this as overglorified DLC is the fact that it's less than like 10 hours in length if you decide to go a bit fast through it. Oh, and we can't forget to talk about the swinging. Oh my god, the swinging. Listen, if you played Spider-Man 2018, this section may not be ridiculously revolutionary to you, but dear god is it just as good as the original. Like, the amount of sick parkour web-slinging combos and sheer stimulation you get just by traversing the map made fast travel a disrespect to have included in this game. Like, in my personal playthrough, I only used fast travel once, and that was when they were introducing the mechanic and wanted to demo it. Other than that, I found it pointless because it was so much more fun to just swing from building to building to see what sorts of crazy stunts I could pull off on the way to my next mission. It was borderline addicting. Like, seriously addicting. But with that out of the way, that's going to do it for the gameplay section, and as you could tell, I enjoyed it quite a bit, so I'm going to award it a subscore of 9 out of 10. So why not a 10 out of 10 since all I seem to do was praise it for the last 5 minutes? Well, that's because I don't think the game did enough differently from Spider-Man 2018 to warrant that score. You know, don't get me wrong, the gameplay is great, but at its core, it's basically Spider-Man 2018's gameplay with a couple of big twists. You know, bioelectricity, camouflage, and a slightly different feel. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because Spider-Man 2018's gameplay is an absolute masterpiece, and had I had a YouTube channel at the time, I probably would have awarded that game a subscore of 10 out of 10. But I'd feel wrong giving this a perfect score since the game isn't entirely Miles's, if that makes any sense. Regardless, a 9 out of 10 is a phenomenal score, and for the time that Insomniac had to work on it, I think they did a great job. So now, on to replayability. So, replayability. As I mentioned in my Last of Us Part 2 review a while back, replayability is heavily based on gameplay, since you won't be likely to replay a game that you didn't enjoy playing in the first place. That much is obvious. But once you do create gameplay worth interacting with, like Miles Morales has here, yet another aspect of replayability comes into play. That being, did the developers add good enough incentives to play again? Like, is there even a point of doing it? I see you nodding your head. I know it's a good question. Like, what is the point of playing again? Like, why would I do that? And it's the developer's job to answer that question for us. So, the problem with most games, including Spider-Man Miles Morales, is that they never quite nailed the replay button in the way that they should. Because if you're anything like me, most games are one and done, and I don't ever plan on returning to a game unless I get a nostalgia itch several years down the line. And even then, that's unlikely too. And it's because developers rarely add good enough reasons for me to care to play the game again. Like locking extra abilities and item slots behind a new game plus like this game does here, won't be enough for me to pick up the controller once more. I simply don't care. And I could already see the 100 plus platinum trophy tryhards ready to flame me in the comments, but you guys have to realize that you're a different breed. Like, much love to you and respect for what you bring to the game, conversations, and doing Easter eggs so that the rest of us don't have to. But nah bro, you guys are built different. Us normal folk are going to need a bit more reason to play the game again. And I don't think Spiderman Miles Morales offered enough of that to guarantee that I'll play it again for a second time. But I also don't think it did a terrible job, all things considered. Oh, and I should probably clarify what I mean by play again, since it could get a little confusing with how games organize themselves nowadays. So I consider the main story and main side missions as the game. Everything else is kind of like extra challenges and manhunt type objects in my eyes. And while these challenges and objects do add a bit of value to the game once you've already decided to replay it, there's nothing saying that you have to click that New Game Plus button and start a new playthrough, which is what I personally consider a replay. Everything else on the map would just be challenge completion. Because for those of you guys who don't know how it works, during a New Game Plus in any game, you basically start the main and side missions all over and reprogress through the story as if it were a new account, with the only difference being that you keep everything that you unlocked from your previous playthrough. And to me, that's a replay. Deliberately starting a New Game Plus to see what you miss, do some missions better, or to find some Easter eggs and lore. Sticking around and doing challenges and free roam after the game has ended isn't really quote unquote a replay of the game. Like I said, it's more like challenge seeking. And now that I've cleared that up, I hope you can see what I meant when I said that most games don't really give you a real reason to play through the game again as intended. So if you're not a completionist, odds are you probably never will. And Spider-Man Miles Morales falls a bit victim to this as well, but not terribly so. See, if you want someone to replay a game, the best way to do it is A, offer a New Game Plus, which this game has, but B, also offer extra lore and extra story elements that could only be seen through another playthrough. Like, I'm not saying take elements from the main story and lock it behind another run of the game. That would be stupid. But I am saying another playthrough should offer new insights never before seen without changing the overall narrative. And games that do a phenomenal job at this are the ones where you have to make choices that affect the story's ending, since most people might want to see what would happen had they chosen another option at a story-changing crossroads. Games like this incentivize you to play again just to see what would happen, all while telling the same story. And if you want another example of a game that has phenomenal replayability, just so you know I'm not making any of this stuff up, look no farther than a game called Nier Automata. If you're a subscriber of mine, you've probably heard me talk about it, but in that game, you could finish the main story in about 7 to 10 hours depending on how fast you play. But if you stop after that playthrough, you're really missing out on a bunch of context and perspective that the devs want you to see. And honestly, after playing the game, it would just be saddening if someone happened to stop there thinking it was actually the end of the game. On the second playthrough, without giving you any context, the devs force you to play from the perspective of an entirely different character while progressing through the exact same events. But now that you have a different set of eyes, you're seeing context that you missed, as well as experiencing battles, conversations, and scenes you never would have had you not played it again. And on the third playthrough, you play as yet another character, but this time even farther from the main story, seeing how her order of events led her to meet the characters we originally play as in the first and second playthroughs. And honestly, the third playthrough might as well be a completely different game in and of itself, but it's clearly still telling the same story. The fourth and fifth playthroughs are actually a sort of epilogue providing some further explanation as to what happened to the characters after the original runs, as well as providing some prequel-esque missions that finally reveal odd motivations and emotions. In that game, you need to play through all 5 playthroughs to truly experience the full context of the world and characters, and those are only 5 of the endings you can get. Get this, Nier Automata has 26. Yeah, 26 endings. Admittedly, the other ones are nowhere near as deep as the first 5 and could honestly be chalked up to overglorified Easter eggs, but the fact still remains, this game is replayability on steroids. For what is technically a 7 to 10 hour game on paper, for most, including myself, turned out to be a 60+ hour blockbuster. The fact that you could play through the same story 5 times and get something worthwhile from each individual experience is replayability done correctly. And I hope that little example showed you guys what I consider to be the golden standard of replayability, so that you guys could use it to compare to Spider-Man Miles Morales. But with that being said, I'm going to award Spider-Man Miles Morales with the replayability subscore of 6.5 out of 10, which is slightly above average, but nothing to write home about. Hope you guys don't chew into me too much for that one. And now, on to music. So, typically speaking, I'm not that much of an audiophile, but I'd like to think I could appreciate a good score when I hear one. And to get straight to the point, the music in this game was alright, and hey, put that keyboard down and hear me out. I know that this game had very different music when compared to other superhero games. I mean, for Pete's sake, no pun intended, the PlayStation menu music had that Uptown Harlem vibe to it. But I'd also be lying if I said that every song in this game had that much character. In fact, a lot of it sounded pretty generic, with the exception of a couple standout pieces. I mean, you'd probably be surprised to hear that this game had 19 songs in its official soundtrack, and you also probably couldn't recognize 5 of them by tune even if you tried. And that's because a lot of them are kind of forgettable, and I feel like video games fall into this trap of oversaturating their products with too many songs for every possible scenario, to the point where each individual song sort of loses its meaning. In an effort to make the sounds as diverse and as unique as possible, which on paper isn't necessarily a bad idea, video games nowadays are simply oversaturated with super specialized songs that don't get played nearly as often enough or as loud enough for the player to remember them. And I'm not saying that some scenes or people don't deserve their own music, they definitely do, but we can't just be giving out that privilege like candy. For a game that, by my estimate, would probably take an alright speedrunner 5 hours to finish, and an elite speedrunner probably sub 3, the soundtrack with its 19 songs is about an hour long. That's not a good ratio at all, and I get it. This is not how the game was intended to be played. Skipping cutscenes and whatever is not ideal, and speedrunners are demigods sent from above to show us all how slow we are at playing our video games. But even if you factor in a somewhat brisk runtime of, let's say, around 6 hours, that means you'll hear each song an average of a little less than 6 times, and super specialized songs you'll probably hear even more scarcely. In fact, most of your listening time will probably be the traversal music you get when swinging, so you could kind of see how you just don't have enough time to get attached to any of these songs. And add in the fact that most of them weren't anything to write home about, and boom, you get a song experience that's actually typical and average in video games, but I simply can't give a great score for. And you might be like, well, you can't just give every game a bad music score. And yes, I can. Come now, silly. Did you really think that my opinion would be good on the internet? What I typically find is that indie games have much better soundtracks than blockbusters, since they usually put more flavor and twists on them, and instead of treating them like background music, they use them as an extension of storytelling, which this game sadly did not do. But like I said, despite having a soundtrack that largely did not impress me, there were a couple of songs like the one showing up on your screen now that were really good. I'll put a link to each of them in the description so you could give them a listen and tell me if you recognize them, because I guarantee you the ones that aren't these ones, you wouldn't. I would have played them here, but that's Copyright Central, and we don't like copyright. But with all of that said and done, I'm going to award Spider-Man Morales a music subscore of 6.5 out of 10, meaning that it had some decent songs here and there, but overall the experience wasn't anything super premium, which I honestly think is fair, but let me know what you guys think down below. But for now, on to graphics and performance. Okay, so this part I think is going to be relatively easy to express my opinion on, since I think most people will probably agree with me on it. I think this game running on PS5 with the fidelity preset on, which is how I played it, looks absolutely amazing. This game is able to run at a smooth 4K 30fps with ray tracing enabled for some nice reflections that really make the world come a bit more alive at ground level. And where the game really shines in my opinion is during the cutscenes, or where the developers almost definitely went out of their way to make things look especially beautiful. Like during the scene that was demoed before release where Miles and Genki are walking through a night festival held in Uptown New York. This scene, when I was playing through it, as well as in most cutscenes, kept me really glued to the screen, just trying to take everything in. The lights, the HDR, and the ray tracing was just absolutely stunning. And the resolution of the textures in most places was no slouch either, easily the most detailed Spider-Man game we've ever received to date. And you'd think, oh, if it looks this good, it must perform terribly, right? Well, from my personal experience, no. This game ran at a constant 30 FPS throughout my entire playthrough, and I don't remember a single discernible moment where the frame rate dropped below what was acceptable. It ran almost flawlessly. Almost, because there was one moment where I did have a crash when my game locked up for some reason and didn't want to move past a certain QuickTime event. But honestly, other than that, the game ran flawlessly and I never had any issues with it. And since my PS5 survived the unplug, I can't really complain too much, but I'm going to have to give it an 8 out of 10. Why? Because it kind of looks like a PlayStation 4 title, but with higher resolution textures. Doesn't really feel like they changed too much with how the game was made to really tailor and take full advantage of the hardware in the PS5. And honestly, I'd argue that The Last of Us Part 2 looked about 3 times as good, despite Miles Morales having much more flamboyant colors. And hear me out when I say that. The Last of Us Part 2, while obviously not everyone's favorite game, was interesting because it ran on a console that probably should not have been able to run a game that looks that good. The facial animations, and heck the animations in general in TLOU 2, honestly kind of smack Miles Morales around like a ragdoll. And it runs better than Miles Morales does on the same 7-year-old hardware. In my opinion, the game nailed lighting and ray tracing, especially with HDR turned on, but that's about it. The shadows weren't all that great, the clothing animation was okay-ish, the ground level world kind of felt and looked fake if you stayed there long enough, and I already made my peace with the faces. So that's why I decided to award it with an 8 out of 10 and not better. And trust me, the lighting carried this score like LeBron carried the Cavaliers in 2016. But that's none of my business. Now on to our final section, story and writing. So like I said earlier, this video will be spoiler free, which also inadvertently means that this particular section might be a bit shorter than usual. But honestly, this video has probably gone on for long enough, so I guess that's not a bad thing. So in my honest opinion, the story for Spider-Man Miles Morales was okay. Like, fundamentally speaking, there was nothing wrong with it, and in fact, aside from what I consider to be some major writing flaws involving Miles' best friend Finn that happened near the end of the game, I'd say the writing was generally pretty rock solid. Like, there was nothing in the game that jumped out at me as being implausible or completely ridiculous. Again, aside from a small select group of events that by and large were probably implemented to push the story along, since the devs only had a 10-hour story to work with, even if that meant sacrificing the coherence of some characters. Again, nothing wrong with the story per se. In fact, I'd say it was actually a pretty fun ride to tag along for, but it wasn't really that great. There were no parts in the story that got me supremely invested, and while the writing was typically solid, it was also pretty generic. Honestly, the only 3 moments that actually managed to invoke some emotion out of me was a plot twist that happened pretty early on in the game, which was one that if you follow the Marvel universe even a bit, you'll have easily seen coming, but luckily for the writers, I do not, so I was kind of blown away. And the other 2 moments involved Haley, a deaf street artist who is featured in the story and should honestly be Miles' #1 priority going forward into the next game. Hashtag Team Miley. So while this game didn't feel super rushed despite being such a small game, you know, there was a lot left to be desired in the way of engagement. Drag this game out for another 10 or 12 hours and you might have hit monotony town, which you definitely don't want. I think the 2 biggest distractions for how okay the story was is the fact that number 1, it's a Miles Morales game. Duh. And number 2, the gameplay was just so good that you kind of forget that you're even playing through a story at all. You're just having so much fun beating bad guys up. So, what do I think of Spider-Man Miles Morales? The story/writing section receives a total score of 7.5 out of 10, which I think is actually really fair, all things considered. And again, it kind of feels weird giving the game this score because it's not like the game messed up bad in any particular way when it comes to this stuff. It's more like it just didn't do enough to make me want to give it a higher score, which I think is a pretty important tidbit to point out so I don't get flamed in the comments. But now, on to the final verdict. Okay, so this game wasn't bad by any means. I actually had quite a bit of fun playing it, but it also wasn't as good overall as the first, at least on the story front. But I'm not going to let that fact hold this game back. As a middle child, I always hated being compared to my older siblings, and I don't think we should judge single player video games on that premise either. But maybe that's just the spoiled brat in me talking. Regardless, I had fun with this game and genuinely think it was good, but it's not something I'd go out of my way to recommend to people. It's one of those games where I definitely wouldn't stop you if you've already decided to pick it up, but at the same time, I wouldn't run to throw it in your cart either. So with that out of the way, it is with great confidence and taking all of my previous scores into consideration that I have to award Spider-Man Miles Morales with a final innocence certified score of 8 out of 10, ice cold, which I honestly don't see most people being upset with, but who knows, maybe I'm completely wrong. Well anyways, I'm gonna get out of your guys' hair and let you think of ways to potentially roast me in the comments, or agree with me, who knows. Alright ladies and gents, that's gonna do it for my review of Spider-Man Miles Morales. Let me know what you think of my bad opinions down below in the comments. Do you agree with some of the things I said? Do you disagree? Or did you not even play it yet? I'm curious to hear all about it, so be sure to let me know down below. Now with that being said, you know what time it is. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you dislike the dislike, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a future upload on the channel. Oh, and hit that bell notification button if you're so inclined. I've been Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.